Thank you, Yoko, so much for having me. And thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Well, that's happening. It's perfect timing, actually, because I live in Oakland. And by the way, I'm going to move this over here because I'm really short and I hate standing behind podiums. So I live in Oakland. Oh, and also I can switch sides. So do I have a volunteer over there about halfway through? Just be like, hey, switch sides. Or do you not care? We can care. Okay. All right. And can I have a time check? Because I know we're a little behind. Okay. So I live in Oakland, and I actually I left my state job in May, technically, of 2023, and I went on sabbatical, and I developed a habit every morning of making my coffee, sitting in my recliner, looking out my window, occasionally snuggling one of my cats, and reading some poetry and philosophy. Since I had to be here early this morning, I did not get to that. But I want to take a moment and acknowledge that this is not a normal day, and I'm not feeling normal. And so I didn't get a chance to read my philosophy. And so I chose something that I'm going to share with you all. This is from the Tao Te Ching. There's many translations out there. This one's particularly meditative and philosophical, which seems appropriate given what a big day we all had yesterday. Stretching to reach it, we fall. Running to catch it, we get lost. Pretending to be enlightened, we become dim and foolish. Trying to do it right, we fail. Looking for praise, we receive nothing. Grabbing hold of it, we lose it. All of this strutting, striving, straining, and grasping is excess baggage. The very freedom it promises does not appear until we lay it down. That's passage 24. Great translation. So, given the theme today, I thought I would start with a story. So Yoko mentioned I worked in New Orleans for 7 years. And back in summer of 2005, in late August, that's heavy hurricane season in those parts and in many parts of the country. And when you see a hurricane coming at you, you kind of are constantly refreshing these little diagrams that show the projected path. And it became very clear that the projected path was headed to New Orleans. And weirdly enough, I had just moved to California, San Diego, just a few weeks ahead of time. And I had with me my big, giant GIS machine, right? Like, you remember the days where, well, maybe not all of you do, but where the only way you could run ArcMap or ArcView was if you had a monster tower. I had one of those towers, and I had moved it out with me to San Diego. On Friday, before the hurricane was on its way to New Orleans, our team got on a phone call. So everyone in my team was evacuating. They were leaving New Orleans to be on higher and safer ground. And I was safely tucked in San Diego with internet connection and that mean machine. And so we, in addition to making sure everyone was okay, we thought, hey, what could we be doing to help, provide information? What can we be doing as the Greater New Orleans Community Data Center? And one of the things we thought of was like, hey, if this thing hits and we flood, people are really, really going to want to know the elevation of New Orleans. And for context, we had all the data center. We were the data center. We had data about every single neighborhood in New Orleans. And so while everyone was evacuating, I went on the hunt for elevation data. And this was, 2005, right? And so I found that elevation data from USGS. I posted this map. The date says August 30th. Katrina hit the 29th. I don't know if I posted it the day before and we adjusted the date. I actually can't remember that detail. But this map soon became posted all over the world. So Bloomberg News Network contacted us, like, do we have permission to use your map? Blah, blah, blah. Everyone was using it. At some point, someone pointed out that it does look like a piece of meat, which, fair enough. That was my choice. I didn't have a lot of feedback. My team was evacuating. But this ended up being used by media all over the world, and then we did a whole bunch of other maps. And then about a week or so, maybe 10 days after I published this, someone emails me and they're like, hey, great map. It's not supposed to be in feet, it's meters. When I had downloaded the data from USGS's website, they had been in the middle of migrating to a new data system, and they hadn't migrated over the metadata. When I was creating the map, I could not find the units anywhere, so I took my best guess, and my best guess was wrong. So when we talk about data and we talk about resiliency, a lot of that is being prepared, which means the data is available and ready to use before a disaster. So, quick question, pop quiz. How many of you, so there's this survey that asked like a bunch of like international companies, organizations, insurance companies, etc. Which ones of them felt that they were a data-driven organization? Any guesses what the percent of people were like, yeah, we got this down? 0. That's Oh my God, you guys you're even, okay, they said 27% forged a data culture, right? Which is still kind of crappy, right? Because I think in government, the public sector, we're always like, oh, we're so behind. And I actually found this weirdly, reassuring, right? To know that so many, big multi-billion-dollar companies were struggling with creating a culture of data. And what they noted in this, and actually the numbers in theory have gone up, and we can talk about that later, but they noted that companies focus on the supply side of data and technology instead of increasing demand by business and employees. And they described it as a technology push rather than a pull from humans, and that we hear little about changing human attitudes and behaviors around data. And for me, this is an underlying theme that I try to bring to my approach. And Yoko mentioned, I have a background in design. And design is this process where you really try to seek deep empathy around a problem space, define that problem, ideate, prototype, and test. And that's very iterative, right? And this is underlying approach that I want to encourage you. Anyone can learn how to do design thinking, and I'm hopefully going to show you how we weave it in throughout. And part of that is really understanding what are the problems you're going to try to solve. And throughout this, you're going to hear what are the data problems that we care about that we want to tackle. We just don't want to put data out there, because ultimately you need to find the right tools for the job. So this poor man on the left is underpowered in his quest to pump that tire. And then these two people on the right are way overpowered, right? They've way overbuilt their data. And so all of this led to us creating a 3-part framework of statewide data goals. Of one, we need to build the data roads. That's what USGS did, but they didn't fully get to crafting the rules of the road. And then we want to boost the travelers and build their own capacity to use that data. And so why do we need to intentionally build the data roads? Well, in the public sector, residents touch many of our services, right? And at the same time, we're talking resiliency, we touch, all these different institutions touch different parts of the environment, right? Like, let's think about watershed. You have wastewater, you have upstream water, you have all these different factors that are impacting it. But all of our data is housed in silos. It's like, well, we've got our system from 2005 or 1980, which also I've seen. And basically, we have data scattered all across our counties. And of course, data access matters because if you only see part of the problem, you're like the proverbial elephant and the blind man, where you're saying, oh, it's a policy issue, it's an education issue, it's a jobs issue, et cetera, et cetera. But because you don't have this access to holistic data, you can't really characterize the problem space. And then when you try to find data, like this is a constant problem. I'd be curious to see if this is something you all experience here. If you're lucky enough, in San Francisco, for example, we had 50 departments. At the state, we had close to 200. And if you knew someone had the data, if you knew, which was not a given, how would you access the data? I heard ask them, floppy disk, email, all of those things. Yeah, you're like, hey, can I have this data? And they're like, data provision is not my job. And then you're like, so you keep harassing them about it. And then like you follow up and you follow up. And then finally they give it to you, right? But you inevitably have some questions like that metadata problem we talked about, which leads ultimately to a question data spiral. But maybe finally you get your questions answered, you run the data, you do your analysis, you create your report, you make your dashboard. And then what happens when you have to update it? You repeat the damn process all over again, right? This is exhausting, and I have seen this play out. I have personally harassed people for data over and over and over again. And so really we need to focus on architecturing what I call a spectrum of access from open. There was the open data movement, which was really hot circa 2015. And sure, we can do that for some of our data, but it's not enough. We need to architect a spectrum, an easy, ready, discoverable spectrum of access across all types of data. And I always used to say GIS folks, they were the original open data folks. And I think that has not been honored and acknowledged enough. So just huge shout out there. But it needs to be across the full spectrum of data sources. Of course, we often talk about internal data, but we're creating another blind man in the elephant problem if we also don't think about curated and collected data and acquired data. And so, for example, curated and collected data, almost every department in San Francisco needed neighborhood census data, right? Of course, how many different neighborhood boundaries did we have? Well, planning had theirs, and all the different departments had their own things. And so what we ended up doing is we said, okay, well, we're going to compile the census data by all the 4 different neighborhood designations, right? We didn't have to do that, but it made every analytical job that much easier across the city. So hopefully we can all agree we need to build the data roads, but what do we mean by crafting the rules of the road? And so this is a screenshot from Wikipedia of stop signs from around the world before 1968. This is a screenshot after 1968. My question for you is, when would you want to travel? One just feels a little safer, doesn't it? And I point out, physical standards in the world are so salient to us, right? We think about road signs, all these kinds of things as being very important, but we don't think about the sort of digital road rules as much as we should. And one thing that happened both in San Francisco and the state was that everyone agreed that we were consistently inconsistent, right? We were very good at that. And I think this really became obvious during Katrina, COVID, these C sounds, where I actually went to 4 separate county websites that I shall never name. And I looked for race ethnicity data. On one county, it was not included. Another county, it was included but not required. Another county had this insane scroll box. There were about 50 options, and I tried to animate it, and I'm just not that skilled. And then this other one had at a glance, where it was required, and you could see all your options at a glance. My sort of pop question for the audience is, which one do you think had the most complete or correct data? I would also argue D, but at the state roll-up, we had almost 10% other and 20% missing data. So how can we possibly make questions about equity and distribution if we're not even answering the questions in a way that makes sense and is harmonized across groups? So I tried to make inroads in here, both in San Francisco, in the state, and they apparently finally, was just talking with someone, they finally adopted the standards that we ended up just throwing out there for people to use in San Francisco. They eventually formally adopted it. In the state, we're still working on that. So now how to boost the travelers. Now this is definitely where we get into art and not science, because if anyone's like, oh yeah, I know how to make everyone data-driven, they're lying to you, because no one's figured this out, right? And so what I'm going to offer is a framework that I developed at the state of California, which is really a 2-step plan to think about data maturity. And step 1 is about getting your data house in order. And level 1 is the data void, where you can't answer basic questions about programs and services. In general, I don't think that's the case from what I've seen in the public sector. Most people can answer basic questions, but a lot of them are at level 2, which is data fire drills, where you can answer questions, but only after sort of scrambling around and doing a data drill. And let's say, for example, my favorite is you post a mandatory required report, and then the board of supervisors is like, yeah, but what about this part and this? And I want it by this subgroup. And then your team's like, trying to pull it together. And the problem with data fire drills is, 1, they're exhausting. 2, you might not get consistent numbers over time, right? Which is also scary. So our goal at the state was to get to every department to level 3, data on demand, right? Which this is all your existing data and resources. It's available. You have your metrics, your KPIs, all those horrible mandatory reports are automated, and they're returning trusted, consistent numbers. So if we can get through to step 2, we'll get to step 1, we'll get to step 2 later. So what we have found in my work, and I'd be curious how it is down here in the County of Santa Clara, is that behind the scenes of many data teams, GIS teams included, but less so on the Excel side, is essentially a lot of people doing a lot of manual labor in the preferred tool of choice that seems to never die, Excel, right? And just hammering away at it. So somewhere, someone drops a CSV. Maybe they pull it from a file server, maybe it's emailed to them, maybe they download it from their open data portal, and then they do torturous things to it in Excel, just like hammer the hell out of that thing. And then out pops our favorite consumption tool of choice, a PDF document. If you're lucky, you get a complimentary interactive dashboard that is mostly confusing to interact with, but hey, we're modern and now we have a dashboard, right? And this is what a lot of this mandatory reporting cycle looks like in the public sector. So I call this the Sisyphean reporting cycle, right? Every month, quarter, year, whatever it is, you've got your sort of data people and they push this data report up the hill. And then of course, maybe someone does something with it, but mostly it just rolls back down and then you're back up there again. And so what we worked both in San Francisco, in the state, was to sort of break this torturous pattern of the Sisyphean cycle with really strongly facilitated trainings plus wraparound support and consulting, plus working with department champions or program champions to really not just go from training, hey, one-off, got it, to like cohorts working together to modernize and automate their data work. To essentially turn it into a data factory, which led to automated manual reporting and then really freeing up staff capacity to do the fun stuff, the stuff that they were trained with, the stuff that they got the clean data sets in college, but then, now they're just making reports. And then ultimately that leads to much more robust analytics with training around data viz, data modeling, and data security in governance, where you can loop all of these things in. And just a quick example of the power of data on demand. So one of the departments in San Francisco that we worked on, they had to, and we're going to talk about them a little later, but they had to accurately tax property value, right? That was the biggest source of general funds. Your assessor tax person's right there, right? We're near them. In San Francisco, it was the largest general fund source. I think it was about 30% of the general fund. And this is sort of what their data processing looked like. There were, I think, over 40 spreadsheets that were being used combined with some databases and hacking together to get this and then of course they had the green screen terminals. Do you guys still have those here? No? Okay, we did in San Francisco. And then out would come. After going through our cohort training on how to automate and using these modern data skills, they were able to completely automate the data cleansing and handle the complex data model. And it reduced their workload 95%. That's insane. And they completely had an amazing automated process that it's also easier for someone to come in and help with. So step 2 of the data maturity model is okay, if we can get to data on demand and we're rocking there, we got all our reports running, we're really excited about that. We want to skip to actually using data in decision making, because you put a report out there and does anyone hear it? We don't know. Sometimes you might have to talk about it and testify, could be. And so really, I want to talk about a menu of options, everything from performance management to evaluation experiments to advanced analytics. And then I would argue for having ongoing exploratory data analysis and data development. So we'll talk with performance management, which is of course this concept of, okay, we have our metrics, we're managing to our metrics, et cetera, right? So here's an example that I was not involved in, but my prior team was, of developing a shared decision tool. So does anyone remember the term PPE? Who couldn't, right? Anyone who was breathing during COVID remembers the term PPE. And my old team got this call where they're like, hey, we're having trouble. Our supply of PPE, it's from 2 separate systems. We need your help. And it was 2 separate systems, the Department of Public Health and then the logistics unit, which really worked closely with the hospitals, right? And here's the problem. The same gloves were called 3 different things, or were they the same thing? That had to be figured out. And then they had different units, boxes, pairs, and gloves, right? So how on God's earth do you track and distribute PPE if your 2 main sources of it are speaking different languages from a data perspective. So the team, it doesn't matter what they built in here, I'm not going to talk about it, but essentially they brought in the data from both sides. They refined it. They worked very closely with the two separate departments to say, here's going to be our shared language around PPE and how we decide it. And then they put it in a dashboard so it was easily consumed. And so they went to a single picture that allowed them to effectively manage and distribute their PPE. We'll come back to that. I'm next going to give a quick example of evaluation experiments. So a lot of folks in the data world, I think, have sometimes more of a technology background, but one of the biggest uses of data in the public sector is evaluation, right? And a lot of folks have been trying how to introduce more experimental approaches into evaluation. So here's an example where our tax collector, again, was sending out tax letters. And the first tax letter was on the left. This was the traditional tax letter. So we worked with them to redesign how they did their tax letters and send out a different one to half of the potential recipients. We were able to increase rates of response by 17%. So that's much faster time to revenue. So there's a real example all over the place where you need to, it's not just about technology, but sometimes about how we design and communicate things that are going to have an impact. But what's behind this is a data approach to know, did this matter that we redesigned this letter? Well, you have to know, which means you need to track it. So we actually had to work very closely with them to think about how to instrument and measure the tax reforms letters as they went out and came back in. Now on to advanced analytics. So this is sort of placeholder for machine learning, data science, all that good stuff. In my experience, be curious to see if it's different here, most public sector entities aren't really doing much data science and machine learning work. They're doing a lot of reports. Maybe they're doing some descriptive analytics, but they're not doing a lot of this. And I think in my experience, a lot of the challenge is what I call the truffle pig problem, which is that identifying good data science projects is one of the biggest barriers to doing data science in government. So, and you kind of know you have a truffle pig problem if, one, you're always being asked for dashboards or maps in your case, right? As if that's going to solve the universe. Or could you build a warehouse? We've gotten a lot of those requests over the year. Or could you automate this process? That's a great IT problem. So these are all good problems, but they're not data science problems. And so what we had to do was design a process to sniff out, like a truffle pig sniffs out truffles, we wanted to sniff out good data science projects. And so our solution to this was something called the project topology, which I'm just going to unpack a couple examples. So the first one is how prioritize your backlog. So you're maybe, in the public sector, we have a lot of backlogs of things, right? We have assessments, we have audits, we just have stuff that we have to get to. And the order in which we usually tackle it is FIFO, first in, first out. In data science, what we do is we sort of create a model, we categorize and group those, and then we reshuffle your backlog, right? Or maybe we treat different cases differently. But the result is that departments are addressing high priority first. And this could be risk, this could be opportunity, this could be, any need, anything you want. And here's another example going again on property taxes. And this was also from San Francisco. So if properties were selling all the time, we have to say, was that a fair market value? So for example, if I sold to my niece and I was like, hey niece, I love you. I want you to be successful. It's really hard to buy houses out here. This house is worth $1 million. I'm going to let you have it for $500,000, right? Great for my niece. She got it cheap, but unfortunately property taxes need to be assessed at $1 million. So how do you figure out which properties to answer that with, especially when your assessors have a huge backlog? Right? Backlog going years back. And this was having a huge impact even on bond ratings, right? I sat in on a bond rating meeting and we got all these questions about our backlog of property appraisals. What we did was we ended up developing 3 separate models based on condo, multifamily, and single-family homes. We mixed this in with property characteristics like date sold, square feet, location's always important, neighborhood. And those set of models essentially generated a price prediction. So for every single property in San Francisco, we said, we think if this sold today, this would be the price. And then what we did is we said, how does that prediction that we made compare to the actual sale price. And so working with the assessor's office, we said, well, you know what? If the predicted price is within a range of the sale price, instead of like manually assessing every one, we're going to go through and just have a quick quality check with like 1 or 2 folks. So we're still putting eyes on it, but we're not like doing a full assessment. And then all the ones that were way outside the range, or actually the range was really narrow to start. They were like very conservative to start, which I get. And then we pumped those out for a full appraisal, right? Make sense? Okay. The very first time we ran the model, we reduced their roll 10%, which accessed 2.8 million in tax revenue. The very first time. Since then, that combined with that other example where they automated all those reports from 42 Excel spreadsheets to a single automated process, all of that plus several other things, since then that department eliminated what had been a 25-year backlog of assessments. It's now gone. They're on top of it. Woo! All right, next topic. Flag stuff early. And stuff, it could be people, it could be things, it could be vehicles, right? But the idea is hard to predict future condition, which leads to reactive services. So in data science, we would look at your historical current to create estimate ranges, and then divert you away from that, with the idea that we're focusing on proactive early interventions versus this like constant like catching up mode that we're usually in. An example of this was a department came to us, in this case, Women, Infants, and Children program, so WIC, where they were watching people drop out, and they'd had a steady dropout, 16% since 2011. And of course, it's really important because we know that nutrition is so important for outcomes later in life for kids, whether it's health, education, economic opportunity, all kinds of things are vastly impacted. And we are only seeing 28% complete the program. In the WIC team, they were wonderful. They had all kinds of theories about what was going on, but that was all anecdotal, and they'd never really looked at their data. And of course, where was their data? It was locked in some vendor system, and the only time they got to look at it was when the vendor ran the report for the mandatory annual report, but they'd never looked at their data over many years and really like churned through it and looked at all the factors. So we ended up ultimately developing a tree model for them. But the biggest, and what a tree model does is it starts at the top and it says, these branches are the most important factors that sort of change the outcomes. And so what we found was that English speaking was hugely impactful on whether or not people made it through the program. As in, people who spoke English were less likely to make it through the program in this case. Also, feeding choice and prenatal engagement. And so what this ultimately led to was a theory that maybe people are feeling stigmatized. And I always say that what we can answer with data, we can answer who, what, when, where, how, but we often need to talk to people, God forbid, to learn why, which means we need qualitative data and design methods to engage people. And so what they ended up doing after the qualitative results confirmed the quantitative insights was they developed an anti-stigma campaign, figured out new technology to make it a little less obvious, and then changed their outreach strategy specifically with doctors around helping to destigmatize this. Let me do a time check. I have an example that I can skip. I'm going to skip it. It was a fun one, though. A note of caution is that if you're doing data science, you have to incorporate ethics into it. And when we were starting our work, there was a lot of hand-wringing around ethics, but almost no practical guidance out there. And so me and some folks from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, we put together an ethics and algorithms toolkit, which hopefully we've made lots of changes in deploying this both in San Francisco and at the state. And hopefully me and a colleague will get some funding to overhaul and make this easier and update it. But in short, it became part of our process. And importantly, we used the ethics toolkit both before we did model building and after model building to really understand that our choices and the choices we're embedding into this model and process made sense. One thing on data science is that in general, this data work, whenever you're doing data projects, you kind of have to embrace that it's inherently uncertain, right? There's a lot of technical and social uncertainty. There's no such thing as zero risk, like we're very anti-risk in government, and that this is why we need things like the ethics toolkit to sort of balance practice and policy with benefit and risk. You can learn more. We have a 4-part blog series on that. I want to close with just some back to philosophy. Sorry, I was a philosophy major. It's hard for me not to go there. Some closing food for thought. One, don't jump into data science and advanced analytics. I know like that and Gen AI are hot, and we're going to talk about Gen AI. You're probably like, wow, she's been talking. We haven't heard about Gen AI. And so definitely use the maturity model. So, especially those of you who are in central data teams, but even if you're in a department, use the model sort of like, even if you can't like openly diagnose them, you have eyes and you can read things and you can tell where departments are actually at, probably for the most part. If you're running a performance management program, beware of something known as Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure because people start doing weird things. And I'll give you an example. But this might be less of an issue at the county level. I think it's particularly challenging in cities with mayors and basically people who are sort of very political. I've been meaning to write a blog post about this one day. But this is a great example. So if you measure people on the number of nails made, you might get thousands of tiny nails. But are those the nails you need? If you measure them on the weight of nails made, you might get a few giant heavy nails. And so you basically need a balanced approach. And in the public sector, I would argue something called the results-based accountability can help counter but not fully eliminate Goodhart's law. Has anyone heard of RBA? No. Oh my God, it's so good. Okay. It's kind of like the balanced scorecard, but for government. I would also encourage you to strive for what I call reporting nirvana, where if you're only doing ad hoc reporting and mandatory reporting, you're basically a report factory, which is really boring and it's not inspiring for your staff. If you're only doing strategic reporting and ad hoc reporting, you're running a compliance risk. If you're only doing mandatory reporting and strategic reporting, you're like super rigid and you can't sort of be smarter and adaptive as new things happen, which is super relevant for resiliency. But also don't make your audience work too hard. I know that everyone loved the Johns Hopkins dashboard, but every time I went to it, I was just so confused. And I'm not an idiot. I'm pretty smart. I mean, I'm not like a genius, but I'm not dumb. And I'm like a savvy data user. And I would just open it and I would get lost and confused immediately. I found that I was constantly going to, can you not see it? The LA's COVID reporting. And it was a single page and I could scroll through it and it would unpack each thing very easily. And it was it was like strolling through data versus a data workout. Also recognize that you guys have programs at the county level, in particular state, county, and federal level that come in different flavors, and data needs vary by flavor. So you might have researcher regulators where, at the state of California, this is Cal EPA, right? Like their job is to like monitor and then regulate. And they kind of have different needs from a funder agency like California Health and Human Services. They essentially fund stuff that the county's doing. I'm sure you guys are well familiar with all the regulations and funds that flow through HHS. And then you have direct service providers that are actually delivering a service, your sort of canonical one being, driver's licenses or, garbage and waste removal. And these all have different groups and they have different levels of data savviness, and they probably have different approaches needed. Definitely showcase your work. Storytelling matters. And the reason it matters is, well, one, it's kind of fun. For example, when we did data science, we would have a data science story case and testimonials. But more importantly, if you're data people, you might not always be invited to the table, like including GIS, or maybe you're a tag along, or maybe you're like the weird 4-letter word that's like on the edge of the room, but not at the table. And so what you can do with storytelling is create what I call the virtuous solicitation cycle. We do a project, we tell the story, we get new clients, we do a new project. So you really have to think about your data work as business development. Also, don't let technology drive the change. For example, I think it was Gemini to create this, but what is this? What happened to this finger, right? And so we need to be very smart and sophisticated users of technology. But at the same time, Gen AI is huge, and it's huge in terms of changing how data teams work. You don't have to believe me. You can go look at other people who are smarter than me that wrote an article, but I did write an article earlier this spring about how I do think government adoption of AI, Gen AI, is going to be very different from what I'd call predictive or ML. one of the last things I want to say is it's important to clarify roles ahead of time and identify gaps. So an analogy I came up with at the state where it's very confusing who is to be doing what is something called the data gym. And so in my opinion, IT maintains the gym, they rent the equipment, they make sure it's clean, Data teams are like your trainers, right? They help you, target your trouble spots, use the equipment in the right sequence and order. But business needs to show up and decide to get in shape. And so I would definitely be curious, like at this GIS data day, how many people from the program side are here? A couple. Great. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that because we don't have time. For any leaders and managers, I do want to just add and I have a blog post on this, like you need to approach data like you manage an asset. In the public sector, how many hours do we spend on our budget every year? A lot. How many hours do we spend on data at the leadership level? Probably none. You need to hire the right people, which is shorthand for don't hire jerks or like people who don't understand change management. And of course, signal that data matters. And that I just open to questions, but I want to just call back to the title of seeking, right? Seeking the data-driven. I would argue we should probably call it seeking the data-informed organization. And that comes down to discovery and experiments and sometimes failure. But we have to continue to learn, and hopefully some of these ideas will help you all learn on your data in GIS journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. So now we would like to take some questions. If you have any questions, please raise hands.
From the business unit, SEPA. Is this slides able to be shared with us so that we can see some
Yeah,
of the
I can share a
info?
PDF. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and then thank you for giving the frame of how to attack some of these issues, right? How to figure out what's useful. And I think we might have questions later, but until we use those processes, we won't know.
Yeah, happy. Always here.
Any other questions?
Just a quick comment. All slides will be available after the event.
Okay, for those who are online, you can also type in the chat. I can actually read it for you. So any other questions? Go ahead.
Sorry about that. So when we build new processes, how is it able to be maintained? Because, it's always nice to build new stuff, but then we move on to the next new stuff. But then the old stuff, how do you keep it going?
Yeah, I think that goes into a lot of the tool stack and choices you made. So one of the services we rolled out at the state was something called the Modern Data Stack Accelerator. But even with the sort of like automation, we're very picky about what tools we use in terms of they have large market base and they're easy to hire around or contract around, but also they're not overly complex and with minimal to no customization. And you do that along with building internal capacity in cohorts, not individuals. Unfortunately, a lot of training programs focus on, this person learned BLESS. We like to focus on building the capacity of programs and departments at a time instead of so if someone moves on and then they have enough capacity with the tools that they can be like, this tool is starting to fade, let's get out of it, etc. But I do think the tool stack space and data has really shifted over the last even 5 years. And honestly, none of this stuff is that hard or expensive. And so if your IT folks are telling you that, they don't know what they're talking about.
Okay, so there is one question from the online attendee. Do you think that Katrina metadata SNAFU would have happened today?
Yeah, weirdly, I was thinking about that last night when I wasn't watching the news. I think this is a lot of the some of the tools that have come out more recently, I think, are much better at this. And I think this is also where some of the automated profiling and cataloging tools that almost give you a best draft of the metadata that you can then edit, that can facilitate that, I think are really helpful. So we did a lot of automatic metadata generation when we were in City and County of San Francisco. And I think building an automation wherever possible where the metadata is more like refining and editing and not starting from scratch. I think that's the way to sort of streamline.
We have one more question here in the back.
For data design, do you work with any other teams like marketing or sociologists to help design the data the right way?
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I think to that is, so I have one of my biggest backgrounds is information design. And so leaning on that field of visual and graphic design. So there's a lot we can take from that. I'm actually working on redoing my basics of information design class. And so there's a lot of concepts that you can use. So for example, the concept of proximity, a lot of the Gestalt principles from the mid-50s you can use in terms of doing information design and communication. On the things, the experiment I gave you, there's a nice framework, and it's mostly from behavioral sciences around what are the things that humans attend to and how they react. There's a great deal of overlap. So certainly working on the behavioral, using insights from behavioral science and as well as the field of graphic and information design is where I go to.
One more question, I think, unless there's any online.
Just really quickly on that topic, when you're trying to present different types of data from different departments to the public and different users are trying to receive that data, how do you balance that approach of trying to keep consistency as a big organization where you're trying to feed different data from each department?
Yeah, no, I love that question. When I interviewed for City and County of San Francisco, they asked me to I had to interview prompts. Maybe I'm not supposed to share this. Where I had there was an interview prompt. It was an appointed position. Who cares? In the interview, they're like, "Hey, take a data set from the open data portal and do something with it." And I was like, okay, do you really want to hire a data analyst? That's weird. And so I did that, and I only had 10 minutes to prepare, but I was like, oh no, I'm going to spend the second half about how this data portal is failing the user. And in that very first presentation, that's where user-centered design comes into play in identifying personas. So just using that portal, I was like, oh, we have, I called them the resident developer. They want the API and the download button. But then you have the community organizer that needs a lot more gentle introduction to the data set. And and sort of if you think about it through the lens of personas, you have to make sure you're delivering answers to each of those. And so that's a whole giant conversation, but I think using user-centered design to think about and grouping users into groups that are going to use the data differently, from the elected official down to the, unfortunately, often guy who wants programmatic access. And you need to provide each of those, and you have to make each of those choices careful. But at a minimum, everyone needs what I used to call a gentle introduction to a data set or a series of data sets. And unfortunately, we don't do a lot of usability in just how we describe the data around it. So if nothing else, start with usability testing. And you can user test a dashboard and go find your next door neighbor and be like, hey, try to answer this question and watch what happens. You'll learn so much just by incorporating micro usability testing.
Thank you, Joy. I don't see any more questions. So right now it's at 10 a.m. So thank you, Joy, and then let's give her a round of applause.